Happy Arbor Day and welcome to the final session of the third annual Arbor Day webinar series hosted by the Rice Creek Field Station and the Canal Forest Restoration Project. My name is Robert Salerno. I am the Canal Forest Restoration Project intern, and I'm joined by Dr. Kristen Haynes, who is the Assistant Director of the Field Station and one of the directors of the Canal Forest Restoration Project. So today I'd like to introduce and welcome Bryan Ellis, who is a climate change forester with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, who is here to talk to us about forests, their benefit of preserving, and why and what direction our forests are heading in. Just a couple of reminders before Bryan begins. If you're not the person speaking, please remember to mute yourself. If you have any questions, you can put those into the chat and we'll get to those during the Q&A at the end, or you can wait and verbally ask them. That's fine as well. We will be recording this talk and they will be posted on YouTube, hopefully within the next few weeks. And remember, this is the last one we are doing. So all of the talks should be posted within 1 to 2 weeks from now to watch at your leisure. And I think that's all I have to say. So I'll stop talking now and pass the spotlight on to Bryan.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me today. It's always a pleasure to talk on Arbor Day, so I appreciate everyone joining in. It's beautiful here in Albany where I am, and so I expect, hopefully this afternoon everyone's going to get out and kind of enjoy the flowering trees that we're having this time of year in upstate New York, and spend some time outside today if it warms up and the wind calms down. We were pretty windy yesterday in Albany. So today I wanted to talk about New York State's Climate Act, the CLCPA, and some planting goals that are in it, and kind of like our forestry strategies, and give an overview of like where forests are in New York, how they've changed through time in New York, and where we are going to be headed in New York. So here we go. So here's my presentation overview. I'm going to start by talking, about New York's current forest resource, give a brief overview of the carbon cycle, which is how we're analyzing it through the Climate Act, which is a non-traditional way to look at forests. Usually they're seen in acres and in timber value or standing timber biomass, but we're going to be looking at, the carbon value and how much carbon there is in our forests. And I'm going to look over the CLCPA recommendations and how we are looking to utilize New York's forests to combat climate change in New York. And I'm going to talk about some planting considerations because that's a really big part of our strategy here in New York. So the just general recommendations we have, and I'm going to go over those in a little bit more detail later in my presentation, is keeping forests as forests, so preventing the loss of forests in New York. Improved forest management, so improving where we are managing forests across New York. Afforestation and reforestation, so our planting goals both outside of current forest areas and within our forests. A little bit about urban forestry and bioeconomy, which are also pretty big strategies when we're talking about this. So, I want to start off by giving everyone just kind of an overview of New York's forests, and I don't think I really need to go too deep into this slide, as everyone here probably already values New York's forests, but forests in general provide a lot of benefits to the people of New York in terms of wildlife habitat, water filtration, flood protection, forest products that they create. New York is known for its hard maple or sugar maple products. We're known worldwide for making beautiful cabinetry woods and high quality woods in New York. For recreation, everyone really knows about the Adirondacks and the Catskills, the hikes that people do in wooded areas in New York. Obviously, the aesthetics play a big role. Fall foliage coming into New York for things like that, or things that we see all across New York, and that values that trees provide people. And then finally, the climate change mitigation potential of our forests in New York. So, all across the country, not all forests are carbon sinks and store more carbon than they release. And I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but New York's forests are a carbon sink. They sequester more carbon than they release. And that's a really big value to New York and the world that our temperate forests in New York provide. So a little bit, specifically about New York's forest resource is we have 18.6 million acres of forest in New York, and the map here on the left shows in varying degrees of green. So the darker green is your denser forests, and your lighter green are your lighter where we have less forest. So that's about 63% of New York is forested, of our land area, that is. And when thinking about those forests, 13.6 million, so 75% of those forests are owned by private landowners. So unlike a lot of the states out west, New York has a diverse range of people who own their forests. So all different private landowners across the state own the majority of our forests in New York, which is, not what everyone thinks about when they think of New York forests, and they immediately think of the Adirondacks or the Catskills, where we have some large forest blocks. But even with over 3 million acres in forest reserve and about 800,000 acres in state forests, still most of our forests in New York are owned by family forest owners, we like to call them, which makes it a challenge when thinking about how we manage forest statewide, because a lot of different people are making decisions on their land, and how do we help people make decisions that will increase sequestration, prevent forest loss, and really maximize our forests in New York and all the benefits that they provide the people of New York. So just to go over, some brief terminology in terms of forest carbon, just to give everyone a little bit of a background here. Carbon storage is the carbon that is stored in trees within our forests. It's also stored in the soil and in deadwood and in leaf litter. But when we think about what our forests do, where we see most of our fluctuations in above ground carbon is in the above ground, so that live tree biomass of our forests. Carbon sequestration is the flux, so how much year to year carbon is being taken in by our forests, so how much those forests are growing. And then carbon emissions is the release of carbon from our forested areas. And, those do happen through things like wildfires, which are not very prevalent in New York, decomposition, and land conversions all release carbon into the atmosphere. And so, when thinking about our forests, and the carbon fluxes between them, it's important to understand, that terminology. And to get a little more in depth into it, carbon is sequestered by young trees as their forests grow. Our younger forests sequester carbon faster. Then they will store more carbon in our mature forests across New York. But the rate of their growth slows down a little bit. As we have early successional forests, they grow rapidly until they reach, a mature age between 80 and 100 years, depending on our forest type. And, then we will see this balance of, some trees dying, some trees filling their gaps, and that sequestration rate kind of levels off. And then again, we see a lot of release of carbon from our forests from things like decomposition, land use change, insects and disease, which is really important to think about in New York. I'm sure, everyone here has probably experienced a tree dying from emerald ash borer, which has been rampaging across New York and killing ash trees across the state. Hemlock woolly adelgid is another very impactful invasive species that affecting our forests. And, it's a really important thing to think about, especially here in New York, that has pretty much, we're the epicenter of most of these invasive insects because of the amount of action that our ports get. So a lot of these invasive insects are brought in through packing material, crates, and pallets. And so New York really is impacted pretty heavily by these invasive species. And, it's important to also think about carbon dynamics on a forest through a spatial and temporal nature. So, within a forest and a small area forest, so the typical landowner in New York that owns forest owns about 10 acres or a little bit less than that. They can have pretty big fluxes over time in the carbon stored in their forested area. As one big tree dies, that can have a big impact, or if they lose a few ash trees, that can impact. But you'll generally see this trend of increasing. But then that line will flatten out a lot as you look at a landscape scale, as you're looking, more in large areas. And that's something that, with this analysis, we're try to look at across New York. It's also important to kind of put this into the context of our forest area in New York and where we've come from and where we're going to. And, this graph in front of us shows the changes in New York forest area over time from the 1600s before settling of New York. We had a lot of forest area. We had almost 30 million acres. It was almost all forest in New York, to a real decrease around the 1900s, where we were close to only 20% forest area in New York, or a little bit less than that. And since then, so since the turn of the century 1900s, we've been really increasing our forest area as agricultural lands that were really prevalent in those times started to go fallow. Trees and early succession started to take over those areas. And that's something to think about when thinking about our forests across New York, is that the majority of our forests are growing up on old pastures or farmland, and they're reaching to about 100 years old right now, maybe a little bit older, some are a little bit younger. But that's important to think about when we think of the context of New York's forests and some of the trends that we're seeing. So if we start to look back to like 1990, I got 3 graphs here. So one showing our carbon storage, and that's this graph at the top left side. And we're increasing our storage across New York. Every year, our forests are a bigger sink than they are a carbon release. And so we're gaining carbon, and our forests are growing and sequestering carbon across New York. But we are seeing a decrease in sequestration across our forests. And that is something we would expect in a forest that is aging, that we don't have that much forest management that's going on across New York State. We see typically about 300,000 acres of timber harvest each year. And so we're not really having large scale disturbances on the landscape to encourage young forests. And we're getting this maturing of our forests, which is decreasing our sequestration. Other things that play a role into this would be, as I talked about earlier, insects and diseases, and loss of forest area is a big part of this. So, I showed that graph that was showing an increase in forest area since the early 1900s, but we are seeing since 1990 a bit of a decrease in our forest area, and that really has been accelerated since about 2010. And just to give everyone a little context, we're getting these numbers from the Forest Inventory Analysis Program. It's run by the Forest Service. They do thousands of plots across New York each year with a pretty rigorous methodology, looking at the standing timber, the species, the health, what insects and disease are out there. And they've been doing this for since before 1990. So this is what really provides the foundation for how we understand our forests and looking at those large scale trends. It is important that it is, a sampling system. So they're only taking plots and they're not looking at, using aerial imagery or something like that. And that's something I'm talking about a little bit later, that we've been working on, using remote sensing and aerial imagery to try to get a finer scale understanding of what's happening in our forests across New York, and have, a better idea of what levers we can pull to try to improve our forests across New York, and the benefits that they provide all those people. But it's important to think here that we are still gaining forests in some areas of New York. So there are still fields that are not being harvested. We're gaining about 37,000 acres of forest every year in New York. But we're losing about 65,000, mostly to development and conversion for agriculture. So we're losing more forest than we're gaining each year. And I think when people drive across New York and look at, out across the highway, you think, wow, it's a really forested area. But we are actually losing about 75 acres of forest every day in New York, in the tune of, 27,000 acres. And so that, plays a big impact in the amount of sequestration that we can have in our forests to mitigate climate change, but also impacts, it's going to have long-term impacts over the forests that we have, and the benefits that those forests can provide. So I'm going to go a little bit into our CLCPA goals and just talk about the CLCPA in case no one's, too familiar with it. It was passed a couple of years ago. It is the Climate Leadership and Protection Act. it kind of mandates that New York is going to be a zero emitter by 2050. So we have to balance our emissions with our sequestration. And the law kind of mandates that 85% of those reductions would come from greenhouse gas emission reductions, and that other 15% could be made up through sequestration in New York's forests. So when thinking about that and what that actually means, the graph on the left here is just another way of showing our sequestration in New York. About 1990, we were sequestering about 30 million metric tons in our forests. Today, we're closer to 26 million metric tons. So just like that graph I showed earlier, it's decreasing. And in order to get that 15%, our forests would need to sequester about 60 million metric tons. So that's a tall order for New York's forests to double our sequestration without really being able to double our forest area in New York. So how are we going to get there? What are we going to do that? And we looked at where the weak points were in our forested areas, where we can improve our sequestration, the benefits that forests provide, and afforestation, reforestation, so adding forest area to combat that loss of forest is going to be a big part of that goal. Working on our urban areas and the trees that we have in our urban areas is really important because we also see a decrease in trees in our urban scape. As communities age, we're losing more and more trees, and not as many people are replanting them. And urban trees provide a lot of benefits to people in New York. One, they sequester carbon and all those benefits we talked about earlier, but they also provide cooling effects for homes during the summer. And they could also, provide like shade, flood protection, things like that. And so those are all like really important benefits that urban trees provide that even our forested scape does not provide. Bioeconomy, so where the products that we're harvesting go, is also a really important part. And again, improving our forest management in our forests and keeping forests as forests, kind of trying to slow that loss of forest is going to be really important. So I'm just going to go through a few of our strategies in this. Just for everyone's awareness, the scoping plan is in public comment, and they're holding meetings all across New York. So if you go to climate.newyork.gov, you can find out about our scoping plan. You can provide comments, or you could go to a public meeting if that's something that you would like to do and make comments there. But we're actively looking for input on the plan. These are recommendations that came from a forestry panel. So we have experts in the area come together in both forest industry, nature conservancy. Many groups came together to talk about where to go and what strategies that we would need to get to where we want to go with our forests in New York. And so this first, keeping forests as forests, obviously land acquisition, preventing conversion is really key here. But the state, we have a very active land acquisition program, but we realize that the state shouldn't own all the land and that communities should own properties. And not all properties should be owned by the state in terms of we want them under community control. The state doesn't have the resources also to manage them and might not know what a community needs in its forest. Every community needs different things from their forest. So my office recently put out a community forest grant. We're reviewing those grants right now, but we got a wide range of properties all the way from upstate New York down to Long Island, and they provided a bunch of different benefits. We saw communities that wanted to protect forests along their riparian areas to prevent flood damage to their communities. We saw others that had intense development pressure, and this was the last patch of forest in their community. They really wanted to protect it so that people can recreate on it and get out in the woods. We saw a lot of different reasons that communities wanted to protect their forests, and we're working to fund communities to buy those types of forests. The other thing is, I talked a lot about how most of New York's forest land is owned by private forest owners. And the costs of owning land in New York has gotten more and more expensive. And as we looked at the trends of how large parcels, like how big a property that landowners have in New York, we've seen a continuing trend in decrease in the size of forest parcels in New York. And so that parcelization, fragmentation of our landscape is going to be really important when thinking about the connectivity of our forests, how wildlife are able to benefit from it, and a lot of those benefits. So New York State currently has a 488 Forest Tax Law program, which reduces the taxes on your forested parcel. All states in the Northeast have a current use program, and it reduces that tax burden by 80% on a forested area. But New York's law was enacted in 1974. It's old, it's outdated. It focuses on timber value of that property. It is 50 acres or more that you have to have in order to qualify for this program. And it has some really archaic penalty structures that have no flexibility. So that there's some problems with the program, but it does have pretty low enrollment because of those programs. So we see only about 9% of our eligible forests in New York are actually enrolled in the program. Where a state like Vermont, which has a different program, their use value appraisal program, has close to 70% of eligible properties enrolled in it. So we looked at how we could provide a program that might be better suited to the people of New York now than it was in 1974. And it's important to think that in 1974, larger tracts of land were owned, and we weren't really thinking about carbon and those types of benefits that forests were provide. It was a more timber focused time when we were really thinking about those products that were coming off of our forested lands. And so, we thought about the need for new legislation to amend our current 488 program and create new ones. So create programs that have lower acre thresholds, that are focused not on timber value, but on carbon values of the property or open space. And that really focus on the idea that if a harvest does happen, you need professional help. So we don't want landowners going right to a logger. We'd like them to go to a forester, to have someone who is professionally managing their property. And that shows that better outcomes tend to happen in terms of sustainable harvests when you have a forester involved in a management plan on those properties. So those are some of the requirements of those programs, but they're all really, none of them have been fleshed out yet. They're just recommendations in the plan as something that we would need in order to really help landowners manage their land sustainably and keep their properties. Because most landowners say they would love to keep their forests. It's those costs of owning their forests that really cause people to sell their properties and parcelize them over time. And so giving landowners the tools they need to do this is really important. And then regulating forest land conversion. So we value wetlands across New York. For many years ago, there's this really big push to improve water quality. And so, laws were passed that prevented wetland conversions across New York. And thinking about forests in a similar way and the benefits that they provide is one recommendation that came out of the panel as well. So, avoiding removals of forests, minimizing it when possible, and then mitigating it. So, if someone was going to convert a large area of forest, maybe they would need to plant another area of forest to kind of mitigate that damage that was done. Would be something that would go into a no net loss of forest kind of regulation. And then, the next strategy is thinking about our current forest areas that we have, the management that's happening on them, and then improving that management. And a big part of this is forest health. Landowners overwhelmingly say that they want to manage their properties sustainably when they do. But, an insect and disease is something that's really affecting our forests across New York. So emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid are killing thousands of trees across New York every year. And we see new ones every year. The colorful bug on the top right corner here is spotted lanternfly. That is mostly an agricultural pest, but it does feed on a variety of trees and could have a huge impact on our forest understory through the sooty mold that they create in the understory, as well as reducing the vigor of our trees. We also had a huge outbreak of gypsy moth last year, and we're expecting to see another large outbreak across New York. And so what are we going to do about pests like that that are killing oaks and other trees in the area, these generalist species that are killing a lot of trees? Climate change plays a role into this as we have warmer winters, less severe cold snaps. We're seeing, a lot of these species that might have been cold limited in places like the Adirondacks really expand their ranges. One really prime example of this was in Long Island, we have southern pine beetle that has moved through Long Island, killed thousands of trees in their pine barrens area. That's a native species to the United States, but Long Island is the most north that they found it until this most recently. And I don't actually have numbers to where they recently found it, but I think it's been found as far up as New Hampshire now. And that's a species that is expanding its range. It does not overwinter well, but with less cold winters, we're seeing it really start to spread into new regions of the country. And so we're going to have to be aware of what's going on. We're going to need to monitor for these species and then respond rapidly where appropriate. New York has a large forest health program that is doing trapping across New York for these species, really trying to be on the forefront of it. When southern pine beetle was found in Long Island, we sent chainsaw crews down there to really try to head that infestation off, and it's been extremely successful in doing that. And so, getting out into those communities that haven't experienced those pests before, doing education and outreach, and then being aware of what is coming is going to be a big part of the strategy. The other things that we're going to need to improve of is where we're doing forest harvest. We need to do harvesting better. There's a history of high grading in New York, people taking the best and leaving the rest. And so people, we have a lot of forests that have been degraded. They've lost a lot of their potential. When you take the biggest trees out of a forest area, we lose that best genetic stock in that area. And so doing outreach to landowners, working with landowners is going to be really important. The map we have here on the right is regeneration status in our forests across New York. This was work that was done by TNC, and it talks about where we have secure regeneration in our forest. So where if we lose the overstory to a storm event or a timber harvest, where we're going to have successful regeneration of new forests in New York. And unfortunately, this map really shows a dire picture of really insecure forest regeneration across New York. And that's due to a few different things, but a lot of it is deer and competing vegetation. So interfering vegetation from invasive species, mostly shrub species, but a really big overpopulation of deer is a huge problem in New York. They're eating all of our understory trees. And without proper fencing and preventative measures, we're really seeing it hard to have a new forest come up when we lose forests. So that's leaving us to areas that are persistently in shrub and are not succeeding into forests over time. It plays into our loss of forests across New York, and it's something that we're really going to have to address both in the management of deer and in things like fencing and facilitating regeneration in places that we need to bolster it, because nature, because of the fragmented nature of New York's forests now, the lack of hunters and natural predators on the landscape, we're going to have to intervene to make that happen. The only places that we really see secure regeneration in New York is in the Adirondacks, where we have big tracts of land. Deer are actually an edge species, so they do really well on the edges of forests. And so, places like the Hudson Valley really have a big overpopulation of deer, while, places like the Adirondacks, where you think of for forests, they have a lot less deer per square mile. And so we have really good regeneration in those areas, opposed to some of our more developed parts of the state. So that's a really big problem. I think that improving silviculture, 480A and Regenerate New York both play an important role in this. Regenerate New York is a new program that DEC is putting out to help cost share a lot of these practices for landowners to improve regeneration across New York. And I think we're working on putting out a new round of that early this year. And 480A studies that look at management on 480A properties versus on properties not enrolled in 480A show that there's better management on those 480A properties, because the plans are reviewed by foresters. There's rules as to what kind of silviculture has to happen there. And then there's that oversight really helps facilitate better outcomes, both for the landowners and for the forests. Bioeconomy is also a big part. So in the products that we harvest off of the landscape, if we're creating durable, what we call durable wood products, so cabinetry, building materials, that carbon is stored long term. And so, understanding what kind of products are coming off of our forests will help us better understand the long-term effects of that harvesting. Where we're getting quick releases from products like, if wood chips or things like that are getting harvested, or where we're having like longer term effects. And then this graph on the right is really interesting, where if you use lumber or a wood product, we have sequestered carbon from that, where if you use concrete or steel, we have a huge carbon release in the creation of those products. There's a lot of things that we're working with now in terms of mass timber, which build big buildings out of timber, and laminating timber to build like bigger structures, being able to build bigger structures from timber. So those are things that are emerging technologies that we're working with, how to get them adopted into building codes across New York and get those non-traditional building methods adopted by developers across New York. And then this is the one we've all been waiting to talk about, is afforestation, reforestation. So where we can add forests across New York, how we can add it, where our bottlenecks are. This map on the right shows where we have available land in New York. It was done using remote sensing by TNC again. It looks at, maybe about 4 million acres of available land for forests across New York. But, I think if you really start to dig down into those numbers, you're thinking that not all of it, like non-forested areas, are really suitable for forests. We have a lot of agricultural lands that we need local food sources in New York. We also have pastures, things like that. And we have a lot of endangered birds that really need open grasslands in New York. So, when kind of drilling down into that, we've seen, maybe some estimates come back off that 4 million acres, more towards maybe 2.8 million acres that would be available. Again, these forests are owned by private landowners. And so not all landowners want forests on their lands, even though there is a huge benefit to having them. So how do we incentivize people to put in forests? And then reforestation. So we have a lot of understocked forests across New York that, due to invasive species or poor management, they're not really using up all of their growing space. And so they're not providing all the benefits they could provide. Urban forestry, again, planting trees in urban areas is really important, and increasing that urban canopy provides a lot of benefits to people. And we have an urban forestry program at DEC that provides grants to communities, both for creating management plans, doing street tree inventories, so they better understand their urban forests, as well as doing planting. We need to increase and bolster those efforts to really start making a bigger impact in the future. And so, I just want to talk a little bit about like the reforestation and afforestation in New York, what we are looking at doing, what potential New York really has to do some of these things. So, these are really going after some of the things that I've already talked about. So we have an aging forest structure in New York. Our forests are getting older. There's really a need to manage them because we're going to get a lot of mortality in our current forested areas. We also have about 43% of our forests in New York, according to that, those FIA numbers, are moderately stocked or poorly stocked. So they're not fully stocked for one reason or another. And so how we can identify those stands across New York and then rehabilitate those, what techniques we need to use to improve stocking, to improve the species composition and genetic quality of those stands is going to be really important moving forward. We also see that there's a lot of like what we would call unacceptable growing stock. In forestry terms, that means a tree that will never become a forest product. Not all trees need to do that. Some trees provide a lot of wildlife benefit that are, unacceptable growing stock because they have cavities for, woodpeckers or other species. But we do have a lot of trees that, are poor form. The best trees in that stand were taken out for a harvest, and trees that will never really grow fast, and they're stunted, and we need to really restart a lot of those kind of stands to improve them. And so we're looking at, rehabilitation through silviculture and needing to jumpstart these stands. And so when thinking about afforestation, reforestation, seedlings comes up a lot, and where we're going to get planting. And so there's been a lot of studies that have kind of looked at this, but we're really in dire straits in New York and across the country right now for planting efforts. And it's going to take a really big effort to try to get the trees necessary for both our afforestation goals, if we're going to add like 1 million acres of forest in New York, and for our reforestation goals and planting in our wooded areas to try to facilitate better regeneration. As we talked about the deer impacts, we're going to have to add trees in our forested areas, protect them from deer in order to get new forests to come up in those areas. And so, when identifying that pipeline, we start with seed. And we have huge seed shortages across New York. Our nursery industry, but it's nationwide as well. We used to have a wide variety of folks that were collecting seeds in New York, and we've had a general aging of that population, and we are no longer getting the seeds that we used to. Our tree nursery does pay for different seeds each year, and we're always looking for local stocks of climate adapted species to grow in New York. We don't want to be importing seed from Pennsylvania or some other location where we might be getting trees that might be not of New York genetic stock. And so identifying those shortages, identifying species that we need is going to be really important, and then developing a strategy of where we're going to plant them in nursery settings to grow them to the available size that we're going to need. With a lot of these climate goals across the country, we're seeing a lot of direct seeding where people are just throwing tree seeds on the ground. And these efforts are sometimes very successful, especially in Western areas where you have conifers growing. And we've seen a lot of companies create novel methods of doing this with drones or different things like that. In New York, that would be a really ineffective strategy. We don't have, very large areas that are inaccessible for folks. Our tree species that we'd be really looking to replant would be hardwoods, which don't grow well out of seed. We have very poor survival. And again, the deer pressure is going to really impact that. And so those direct seeding is taking a lot of our nation's seed supply, and it's getting really hard for places like the Saratoga Tree Nursery to get seed at an affordable rate to be able to start planting the seedlings to be able to put out onto the landscape. One example our nursery talked about was where seed that they were buying a few years ago would cost them about $50 per pound, or they're now paying $300. And so those prices have gone up drastically. And so we really need to start emphasizing how we're going to get, community-led and more local seed sources to help supplement those efforts. And then our nursery capacity. So most private nurseries across New York produce trees that are more like yardscape trees, so trees that are better for urban settings. They're growing larger, they have higher value, but if we're thinking about planting trees on a landscape scale, we need smaller trees, bare root stock. Our Saratoga Tree Nursery does a lot of that. There are some other nurseries in Pennsylvania that do grow that kind of stock, but we don't have a lot of that in New York. Our Saratoga Tree Nursery plants right now about 1 million trees per year, and they distribute those across New York. We used to have 12 nurseries during the 1930s and 1940s, during the CCC era, we planted in New York about 400,000 acres of forest across New York. We can see the impacts of those today in a lot of our Norway spruce plantations. Our state forests have a lot of those plantations that were planted, and we had 12 nurseries supporting that effort. Today we have 1 tree nursery that is not even using its whole capacity. So that's going to be a really big challenge in increasing planting across New York. And I guess the one other thing I'd like to add here is that, it takes a couple of years to grow a tree to be the proper size in order to plant out. So, even if we wanted to increase planting by hundreds of acres next year, it would take us, a few years to even to add those trees, to grow them to their optimal size, and then to get them out in the landscape. So, and then in order to get them to establish into a forested area and to start sequestering carbon and providing those forest benefits, that a lot of the research shows we're looking at 15 to 20 years after that. And so to meet 2050 goals, we should be planting yesterday, is what I'm kind of trying to say here. Outplanting, then finding those areas to plant trees, how to get the tools into landowners' hands to plant trees on the landscape. Finding planting crews to do that. We don't have large planting crews across New York that have done these efforts. The CCC kind of spearheaded this in the 1930s, and we don't have those crews today. We rely largely on volunteers and some other help that comes up, from the South, where they have a lot more planting efforts, and that's a more established program. And so that's going to be a big issue. What species we're planting is also important. Are we going to think about things like assisted migration of tree species, as some species are less adapted to the changing climates in New York. Hemlock, for example, while it has invasive species that are affecting it, it's also something that is not very drought tolerant in the summer. We're seeing longer summer droughts. Well, like last year was very wet, but we are seeing that trend generally. And winters that are less cold. So we're seeing, a few more weeks of growing in both the spring and the fall, making some conifers a little less competitive in those areas, and thinking about what species we want to see across New York that are really going to thrive today and into tomorrow is going to be really important. And then establishing best management practices for the planting of those trees, both for the carbon benefits and the other benefits that they provide. And then the post-planting maintenance. So this is really important, ensuring success. You can't just really plant a tree and forget it. You have to keep doing things to make sure that the tree grows and becomes successful. So in some of our outplanting areas, we'll use tree tubes. Those tubes will then need to be replaced or propped up again as they blow down. There's a lot of work that needs to go into that, monitoring those trees. And then when the trees start to grow up even larger, we're going to need to thin those trees out in order to improve the quality of those trees as they grow, and not have overstocked stands that are going to become more impacted by invasive species, which I talked about earlier. One of the issues with Long Island and southern pine beetle was we had these pine barrens that had not been managed. Fire had been pulled off the landscape, and so you had overstocked stands, which had lots of trees growing tightly. They were really ripe for, invasive species to come in and impact those trees. And the trees had very little resistance to be able to fight those off because they were already stressed from competing with too many neighbors. So, there's a lot of importance of tree planting to ensuring success of it, but there's also a lot of controversy over planting trees. Is planting trees going to be enough to solve climate change? There's a lot of papers that are out there, and people are saying, are trees really the solution? And when you drill down into a lot of these, I think they make eye-popping headlines. But a lot of the things that they are saying is more that we still have to think about emissions reductions in order to get where we want to go. We can't just plant our way out of climate change in New York and across the country. And so even planting a million trees, if you're not doing anything after to ensure their success and you're not continuing to reduce our emissions output, is not going to reverse this trend. So I think, there's a lot of greenwashing when it comes to planting trees, but there are a lot of good efforts out there, and I think tree planting is going to be critical in terms of us succeeding in these efforts. Sequestration considerations. So what trees sequester carbon better? All trees sequester carbon at different rates. We have some trees that grow fast and sequester carbon quicker. We have some trees that are more impacted by pests. So it's really important to have a professional come and talk to you about what trees might be best suited for your site so they can be successful, and balance those different benefits that you want to provide. Do you want oaks that might have a high sequestration rate? Maybe they'd be great for wildlife like turkey. They're long-lived, or another tree species. So talking to a professional when thinking about what you're going to plant is going to be really important. And then disturbances. We've talked a lot about deer in this presentation, but we're also seeing, bigger windstorms. In New York, we had, in Albany recently, we had some big windstorms. We had a lot of trees down in my neighborhood. Those are going to become more prevalent. So having resilient trees, healthy forests that are going to be able to resist these kind of impacts are going to be really important in the future. As well as those kind of like little changes to our seasons in terms of, warmer winters, maybe spring starts a week or two earlier. Trees that are going to be well adapted to those is going to be really important. Trees move slowly on their own. They take a long time to grow. So, thinking about that when thinking about the future of your forest is going to be important, and getting training out to professionals in the area is something that DEC is going to need to do to try to get some of these concepts more worked into a lot of our professionals across New York that are assisting landowners in planting. There's a lot of planting vulnerabilities. So this is just like a real rough breakdown of like trees that are more vulnerable versus less vulnerable. Again, some of our fast growing trees, some of our trees that are affected by invasive species are going to become more vulnerable just because they're less resistant to those changes that we're seeing in precipitation across New York, and wind throw, because they might not be as strong, are all going to be things that are going to be affected. But it's all based on where you're located in New York. And, we see, hemlock being pretty successful up in the Adirondacks still. We see it dying off just because it's too warm in the Hudson Valley. And so those are things that you got to consider depending on where you are in New York. And finally, there's some things that are really important for our forests, for forest connectivity. So if we add 1 million acres of forest, we have more connected forests. It's going to be better for a lot of different wildlife and the movement of tree species. Natural regeneration, I just going to try to nail this home, is deer are a huge issue across New York. We got to protect our trees from deer. Even my suburban scape, if I plant a tree, I have to put protection around it, or else the deer will eat it alive. So. And the last thing I just want to plug here was Regenerate New York. It's a program that's going to be opening up soon for its round 2. It provides funding for landowners to plant new trees, to put up protection like fencing, to protect trees. It's looking at really not as much yard trees, but more of that like landscape size scale thing. If you have a field you wanted to plant, if you have a stand that needs to be rehabilitated, this program provides a lot of cost share for that. So it's a new program that DEC is putting on and trying to really get after some of these issues. And these are the kind of activities that it goes after. So it's really getting after the heart of some of these problems, like deer, competing vegetation, invasive species, forest stand restoration, and afforestation and reforestation. But it was funded about $450,000 last year. That, at over $1,000 an acre for treatment. We treated about 500 acres last year through this program. So when thinking about the 18.6 million acres we have in New York, we're going to need a lot more funding if this is how we're going to do it. So solutions like 480A, where we make it more manageable for people to own their properties and we're not giving direct assistance, might be more economic. But things like this are going to be a key part of that puzzle. And that's all I have today. I know I went through a lot of information quickly, but I really appreciate everyone who came on, and be glad to answer any questions if people have any thoughts.
I have one question. I know you mentioned earlier about the importance of urban forestry. What are the legal and legal differences in creating and maintaining urban forestries rather than in more rural and large scale areas?
Well, it all depends on tree ownership, right? So in an urban location, depending on who owns the land that tree is on, that depends. It varies from community to community. So, I've got a tree in my front yard. I own that tree. I'm in charge of its maintenance. If you have a sidewalk and a tree between the sidewalk and the road, sometimes those are owned by the town or the city, and that's their responsibility. So those play a big role into it. If we're in a rural environment, it's going to be based on that landowner again, but it's a little more straightforward usually in those situations. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Yep, no problem.
Bryan, we have a question in the chat from Valerie saying, what steps are being taken to reach out and encourage more cities to develop their urban forest?
Yeah, so we have a pretty developed urban forestry program in New York. We've got urban foresters in every one of our DEC offices, and they work with communities to become what we would call tree cities, or through our traditional forestry programs. They help to create tree boards in their communities, and they also help support, what are they called? A bunch of grassroots efforts to work on, better managing of urban landscapes. We also have urban forestry grants where we, help fund management plans to do inventories of street trees across in our cities, and people can apply for those, and then do planting efforts, where we see issues, or remove trees. The grant kind of changes every year based on the needs that we have. But, I will say that the newest budget that we got from New York State did triple the budget for urban forestry grants. So we're going to see a lot more of those going out, which should hopefully help.
There's one other question in the chat right now, Brian. Eric asked, do the estimates of how much forest New York State needs to regenerate to offset carbon emissions take into account the simultaneous loss of forests over the same time intervals, such as losses from emerald ash borers, etc.?
It takes into account our general trends that we're seeing in terms of our forest sequestration and the loss that we're getting in terms of forest area. But if a forest is damaged by emerald ash borer, that's not actually a conversion of use. So that forest is still a forest, even though it lost its trees. And so that wouldn't be accounted for in terms of the the conversion of forests. But, we have been seeing the effects of emerald ash borer for the last 10 years in New York. And so those are played into the numbers. I would say that, FIA reports come out every 5 years. And so it's going to be really telling in this next round. The last one, they completed their inventory in 2017. This round, they will be completing their inventory this year. And so it's going to be really important to see, because we've seen the acceleration of emerald ash borer across our landscape, the impact that that's going to have in our forested areas. I also would say that I'm expecting an increase in forest loss over the last 5 years as people have migrated out of cities into the suburban landscape due to the pandemic and other factors.
There are a couple more questions in the chat. So let's see, we have, next up is a question. Are there any specific events coming up this summer? Maybe volunteers helping to plant trees?
I don't know I'm not involved in any specifically, but I would say to reach out to your local soil and water conservation district. If you're in the Syracuse area, the Upper Susquehanna Coalition does a lot of work with planting trees in that area of the state. But a lot of these are grassroots efforts, and I know this group here does a lot of encouraging of planting. I don't know if you have any volunteer events, but I'm not aware of any right now, but that's just because I'm not actually keyed into those type of things.
Related to our project, I'll stick a website in the chat where you can go on and sign up to be a volunteer with our project, which is doing some local tree growing and planting. And thanks for the answer, Brian. Okay, let's see. George asks, if long-lived species such as white oak became more prevalent, would there be a large effect on sequestration?
I would say, it will affect sequestration if we have longer lived species. One of the great things about oak is it grows pretty rapidly for a long period of time. Red oak was one of those species that sequesters carbon really quickly. It's really climate resilient because of its deep taproot, so it can withstand long drought periods. Oak is very prevalent in Pennsylvania and some of the states that are directly south of us. And having those trees that are going to be adapted to survive long term are trees that are going to also be sequestering. So I would say that oak's a great species. White oak specifically is a fantastic species. It's also resilient to oak wilt, which is another invasive species that's affecting oak trees. Red oak trees will die very quickly from oak wilt, and we see those impacts in places like Pennsylvania and like the Illinois, Chicago area, where they'll kill a lot of trees. It's spread from root to root, in addition to open wounds on oaks. But white oak seems to be much more resilient to it and can not die as quickly from it, which is fantastic, or spread it as much.
Great. All right, we have a question from Laura. She asks, since we can't regenerate all forests in New York without exclusion fencing, are there any plans to encourage controlling deer populations with hunting?
It's a difficult question. And again, we are seeing a decrease in hunting populations across New York. We are not seeing as many hunters each year. I know DEC does put out deer management permits, more doe permits. They do work on, trying to manage that herd. Again, that's, something that our Fish and Wildlife staff work a lot with, and are really involved in the scientific management of our deer herd in New York. But as a forester, I would tell you that we're probably not killing enough deer, and that's the problem. But whenever I talk to hunters, they say they never see them. So I don't know. It's a difficult problem in New York generally. So.
All right, thanks. And the last question in the chat, will hemp replacement make a significant effect on wood use?
I don't think so. Hemp, I think, is a great product that we're creating. It's growing, it's sequestering carbon. I don't know how much in terms of sequestration that hemp does. I haven't dug into those numbers. It's great that it goes into some longer lived products like clothing and things like that. But, in terms of, you can't use hemp to build your house. You can't use hemp to build a cabinet. And so those are some of the things that come off of our woods in New York that I think are amazing products, and that we are not going to see like the replacement of all of those from things like hemp. I think our forest industry has shrunk a lot in New York since the 1980s, when we had much more forest, like mills and management across New York. And so we have a lot of room to grow if there's a market for it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That's probably all the time we have for questions. Virtually, thank you from all of us to Bryan for spending time with us today on this Arbor Day to talk about New York's climate change forestry efforts. It's been really interesting learning some of the cutting edge things that the state has planned. Thank you to all those who joined us today. We hope some of you might be available at 3 p.m. this afternoon to come in person as we rededicate our campus's arboretum and plant 3 new trees. And if you enjoyed this webinar series, or you're interested in getting a tree from our program, or finding out more how you can help us in our efforts to collect seeds and grow trees and distribute and plant them, you can go to this link I put in the chat to our Canal Forest Restoration Project, and that is your gateway to all of this. We are recording this, and the recording will be available next week. So again, thank you and happy Arbor Day.